Okay, we're ready. And Bill Love is one of our RFA members on water media.
Right. Okay, so for those who've never seen my art before, I have cards with my art and I laid it out on the table there if you want to take a look at that. So I'm going to talk about water media today, which is, okay, it's a broad subject, but I'm going to start with the basics. So what is paint? Paint, you need pigment and a binder, which I bet you some wrong with this. That's okay. All right, so you can buy pigment. This is per number. This is water. I bring a water jar. And you need, it is the diluent, it is the solvent for base. So for this talk, it's always water. This won't change. That's the common denominator. The only thing that's going to change is the binder. So back a bit. Okay, so the 5 types of water media that we're going to cover: watercolor, wash, AC, acrylic, and acrylic wash. And they have different characteristics. I'm going to talk about the differences. And at the very end, we'll talk about how to combine them and how to make them work together. I'll talk about each one separately. I'm going to hand this around, and you can see that some of them are opaque, some of them are translucent. Pass this around. Kind of an inspiration on this whole water media talk. Stephen Quiller wrote this book on water media, and he talks about these various mediums and how to mix them and what's the difference and that kind of stuff. So this is like a good guide or standard if you want to find out about that. Pass this around. Well, or not. Okay, so what's the first one? Next. I don't have control.
I'm dreaming. Okay,
Okay, I already did that. Next.
okay. Oh, all right,
Did that. Next.
okay. Watercolor.
Okay, watercolor. So this is Van Gogh. You do watercolor. That's kind of interesting. You don't think of Van Gogh when you think of oil, but next. Okay, so most of these, with the exception of acrylic, are ancient. I mean, like cavemen uses stuff. And the difference between what makes watercolor paint versus just paint is that it uses okay, it uses gum arabic as a binder. This is the stack. Okay, wing it. So anyway, yeah, gum arabic is what makes watercolor paint. And it's from a thorny shrubby acacia tree like in Sudan and Ethiopia. Next. Okay, what's special about watercolor is that it's very transparent. And when I hand it around that thing, you can see how transparent it can be on paper. Another unique thing about it is that it granulates. I left the whole box. Oh. Okay. Gum arabic. So I'm constantly handing, this is an example of watercolor. And what's unique about watercolor is the granulation. I'll hand this around. So the paint is thin, and if you have a ripply surface, the heavier particles fall into the valleys, and they don't rest on the crest. If you have a heavy enough pigment or big enough pigment, that happens. And you can't get that with acrylic or those other paints. They're too thick. when you do, let's see, you can lift it with the stain, whereas acrylic, you can forget it. And the best type of brush is like a sable or synthetic with a soft feel. And the thing I love about watercolor is easy to clean up. So if I have an accident, I'm not worried about it. If I got it on my clothes or something, throw it in the wash, it's done. With acrylic, it's done in a different way. So,
Bill?
you can- Yes,
Will you
Yeah,
show
agree.
will you show the Zoom audience what you're showing the regular audience too?
okay, I'll do that. I have to face this way.
No, actually, I can just hold it up or you can
Okay,
just hold it
I'll
up to the
get through
camera.
this. So
Thank you, guys.
in watercolor, and it's also very compact for plein air painting. In watercolor, paper is a big deal. The surface, if you get cheap student grade paper, it's harder to work on, it takes longer, and you won't get the same results. So on this little example I'm going to hand around, on this side, I have student grade paper, and with the exact same paint, I painted artist grade paper. And you can see the difference.
Can we hold that up before you- Yeah, hold it up here. Okay, Yes.
Oh, okay.
yeah.
And this is the
so-
one I made pictures of, because it's hard to figure this out.
Oh, I do have, I can probably find them. Okay. All right, thank you.
That's okay.
Yeah,
Just holding it up works for us. You don't need to try to find something else on the computer.
Okay,
Okay, so that's a watercolor. Everybody knows watercolor is very simple. Next.
yeah, oh, sorry.
Okay, wash. Next. All right, this is Toulouse-Lautrec. He did wash and pastel on cardboard. And I was running across an art site and they're selling this plein air material they call carton, some French thing. And it is reminiscent of Lautrec. So I took the carton and I did the painting in wash and pastel. I used colored pencils. And so you get, this is what it would look like with the texture, or how it would appear if you had the Trek in your hand when you did it.
Need to show this.
Oh, thank you,
I will
thank you.
take it from her. and pass it over.
And while you're there, I'm gonna hand this around. And this is what gouache looks like on watercolor. You're gonna be really busy with this hand. We're not gonna-
That's good.
So what is gouache? Next. Next. Well, this is examples of gouache. So this is John Singer Sargent. Back up, next one.
Next one.
This is John Singer Sargent, who did gouache and watercolor. You don't think of, you think of him as watercolor. But in the old days, they used gouache. They didn't, there was no rules or transparent watercolor, or any of that stuff. Next. This is Winslow Holman. You can see that effect if you get the lights, the pastel, the gouache. Next.
Do you feel like gouache is more dynamic, or like you can get more?
It's-
variation?
Okay, so what is gouache? The pigment's the same. The only thing that's changed is the binder. No, I mean, sorry, the binder's the same. Okay, is they add a filler. They can make it okay. There's two ways you can do it. You can modify the pigment to make it larger or more dense by putting more pigment, and that will block out the light, so you can't see through to the paper. Or you can add filler. And filler would be what they call whiting. Chalk. An additive. Okay, so that's really the difference, is that you either made the pigment more dense, or you add a filler, or you do a combination. Whatever you need to do to block out the light. And because it has a more thicker body, it's also referred to as body color. Now Nathan Folks, this is pretty cool what he wrote. He wrote this book about. Hey, don't see it. Took it out already. Anyway, Nathan Folks carries a tube of whitewash, and he has a normal set of watercolor. And when he wants to do the pastel look or wants it to be opaque, he just adds a squirt of whitewash, mixes the paint, and this is the kind of stuff he painted. I had a great book, I can't show, but he does it out in the field. He does it quick. Next. It's pronounced gouache, also known as body color. And just like the watercolor, this is ancient kind of thing. Cave people were marking with it. Egyptians used it. And it's very popular with illustrators. So why is that? When you do an illustration, you make a mistake. When you did a watercolor, you kind of waste time redoing it. With wash, you can cover over your mistakes because it's okay. So it's very popular with illustrators. And there's a plus and minus to this because illustrators, what's the difference between illustrator and artist in the product? You know? And a couple of you were graphic illustrators.
Couldn't tell you the exact distinction.
All right, so let's say an artist is making oil painting, he's going to sell that oil paint. And that's going to be that person's oil painting for years.
Oh, right.
But an illustrator doesn't care about that. They only need it for a photograph that week.
Yeah.
And after that week, they don't care if it's going to trash. So they're not worried about permanence, light fastness. They only need that quick shot. They're done. So some of these colors that you'll see, and like Winsor Newton, more like opera. You ever heard of opera paint, that real bright paint? Brilliant color, and it's useful for mechanical artists and illustrators. But if you paint with it, after a couple of years, it will fade because it uses there's a dye in there besides the pigment. And the dye, just like your fluorescent pens and all that, looks great for a while, and a year later it faded. But illustrators don't care, but they need that color. So that's why these professional paint companies will make a few of those paints. But as an artist, and if you worry about longevity, you want to avoid those. So, next. Okay, it dries. Okay. When you put on gouache, the lightness will disappear, it gets darker, and the darkness will get lighter, and the values kind of going towards the middle. It'll change them. And unlike watercolor, you can work from dark to light. That's another advantage for illustration. And even though it's completely dry, you can take a wet brush and a re-wet, and you can blend it. You can mix it. That's kind of a downside. If you're trying to put on glazes, it's not going to work very well. And the surface of a gouache paint, you don't want the oils from your hand, or you can damage it. It has to be under glass, just like watercolor. And I'm going to try this to see how fast you dry it out. Now, Carol Griswold uses gouache on sketch balls, and it dries pretty quick. Right? Okay, next.
Did you basically say that the gouache will not stand up as long as watercolor? I mean,
No.
will it fade more than watercolor?
Well, if you think about it, the components are no different than watercolor, except with the addition of chalk.
Okay,
So it's not gonna, that won't make a difference.
okay.
But you have to be careful even with gouache that the pigment that's in it is permanent. So like this burnt umber, it's 1,000 years, you're gonna still be burnt umber. But if you take something like a fluorescent dye and get some brilliant gouache paint, you have to be selective. But gouache itself is fine.
That one you passed around, the purple, Was that diagonal or something?
Well,
Was that, will that last a really long time, the one you passed around?
yes, but I see your point, and I have something to show you guys later. In fact, I'll show you that. So what I did is I took the gouaches that had the bad rating, and I took some watercolor paints that had a poor light fastness. And I painted this a month ago. I put it out in the winter. And in that 1 month, you can see which ones faded and which ones didn't.
Purple.
And that's why I pulled out, when I buy a set of these things and I look and I'll look at all the ratings and I go, this is fugitive. Why the heck would I want to take that out? And I brought some back here because when we're done with this, you guys can play with it and see it. It looks great when you paint one of these fancy purples and stuff, but it's not going to last.
So
So
you get rid of the ones that you feel like are not even gonna last?
say it again.
You get rid of the ones that you feel like are not?
I pull them out and I would not use them on a painting that I'm going to sell.
Okay.
But we want to play with it, we can play with it.
Okay. I see.
So I found other similar colors that are like permanent, and those would be what I would paint.
Is this watercolor versus gouache?
Some are watercolors, some are gouache.
Oh.
But I was just showing how things are fugitive and how they can fade, and you don't want your painting to be on that faded side.
When you say fugitive, what do you mean?
Okay, so the,
I use a lot of gouache and I never even knew that some are more color fast than others.
right, so if you look at a typical, there's two systems, but ASTM, American Standards of Trade, American Standard Trade Materials? Testing materials, yeah. American Standard Testing Materials will test this under a super bright light for a certain period of time, and then they check to see how much has faded. And if faded a lot, like practically disappeared or really bad, they'll give it a fugitive or 4 rating.
Okay.
If they expose it for this period of testing time, and at the end, there was no change at all, they would get a number 1.
And where do you find that on the tube?
You'll find it on the tube.
You will?
Yes.
Oh,
You will find it on the tube if it's in the United States, but not necessarily.
Windsor and Newton is what I usually buy. That I have to look for it on the tube.
I always do.
Okay.
There are charts too. There'll be a chart on their website.
Oh,
Lists all their paints and the ratings, or sometimes some catalogs of order from.
Okay. Is that it's amazing how long I've been using this stuff and I never knew that.
Right. Except like Holbein is made in Japan,
Okay.
and they don't necessarily put it on there. You might find their website and it's kind of like, and that's why they made a mistake. I ended up with these brilliant washes. I didn't know better, but don't make my mistake.
Well, I'm
So-
glad, I mean, I can't believe I've been using them all these years. I never knew that.
No, I don't use anything. I use a 1 or 2.
Yeah.
Which is excellent,
Right.
very good. And
Now I
then
gotta
you
go
got
home and
good
look at all
and
my
you got
paints.
fair. And if I'm gonna sell something I painted, I want it to be excellent or very good.
Right.
That way I can,
Right.
they don't put it on the wall and a year later say, hey, my painting, you went bad. What's, can you repaint it?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, let's see, typical, this is a tube of KC, which will come up later. Oh, yeah, down the bottom, it says light fastness 2. That is the ASTM rating. So it is on your tube, you just gotta look for it. Okay. Okay, it's big out, but it has a matte finish, so it doesn't have any shiny look. And if you ever photograph something, and this is why I illustrate like it, you photograph something in either gouache or casein, it photographs really well. And it's kind of hard to explain that, but I've taken pictures of my watercolor and I take pictures when I gouache. And because it has no reflection, just you can manipulate that photographic image. It's really clean. It's hard to explain, but it does photograph well, better than a acrylic. Dry as we talked about, use it just like you spill your watercolors, you pick up, which means it won't destroy your brush either. It's a little bit thicker than watercolor, so you need a little stiffer brush, but watercolor brush will work just fine. And that's the difference. Next. Okay, talk about acrylic. So, acrylic. What is acrylic? What's the component that we need to change? You ought to be smart by that. Which one?
Fine.
Your cool medium. That's all there is to making acrylic paint. Is the acrylic polymer. This gentleman here was invented Liquitex in 19. Have the date. 55.
55.
1955.
Yeah. It was kind of created in the early 30s, to be seen, but the first use for it was experimental, and then they went to house paint. And then this guy had the genius to put it in a tube and sell it to artists. And that exploded. The use of acrylic. Next. This is the first commercial use of acrylic paint. It was 1955. Grace Kelly was on the Life magazine. That was done with gouache. Next. Andy Warhol jumping on the bandwagon in 1962. That's the gouache. I mean acrylic. Sorry. Next. All right. So we already talked about the only difference is this acrylic polymer. And the binder is just a glue. Right. So that's what attaches the pigment to paper or whatever surface you're using. The solvent evaporates. So you're really left with just the glue and the pigment. Same thing with watercolor. It's gum and paper and the pigment. Okay. Before acrylic, in which might surprise you, everybody was using casein. I talk about casein today. You go, what the heck is that? But up till the invention of acrylic, casein was a common thing. Paint houses, paint art, and I talk about today. It just disappeared after acrylic took over. Next, acrylic dries quickly. It forms a flexible plastic film. In theory, if you paint a painting on a piece of paper and you roll it up, and it was painted with acrylic, you can roll it up, ship it, unroll it, no damage. You can't do that with gouache. It'll crack. Easy to clean it only before it dries. Which I found out I've just been experimenting with acrylic, and I got some of my shoe or I got some of my clothes. And, oh crap. I gotta clean it like right now. Because if you forget about it, I mean, if you had your brush had acrylic and you left it and it completely dried, you just lost the brush. So that was a big transformation for me from going from watercolor to acrylic. I'm like terrified of this drying on that. And it'll stick to anything. So if you put watercolor on a wood board, it's going to drip off. But if you take acrylic, it'll stick. And you can change the character with the additives. So you can make it thicker, or you can make it thinner. You can make it thin enough to do your acrylic inks. You can make it impossible thickness. You can add. There's a lot of things you can do with it. Change it. Next. So gouache, we talked about the values. Light and dark come toward the middle. When wet, it has a slightly milky look, but that turns it transparent as it dries. That's called a wet to dry color shift. And it's more noticeable with darker colors because that milky polymer is on the dark background. Next. Okay, so what is acrylic gouache? With gouache. What makes acrylic gouache? Well, we got acrylic paint. So how do we make it gouache? Well, what's the concept of gouache? You make more pigment, or you add whiting, chalk. Now you have acrylic gouache. So now you have the opacity that acrylic doesn't have as much. and it's quick drying. So you're kind of combining the benefits of both. And Illustrator like this one too. Okay. Well, actually, here's this. I'll stop for a minute. I'm gonna blow your mind. This is burnt umber. This is titanium dioxide, which is really the pigment for white paint. So now what is this? It's just, that's all there is to gesso. Really gesso. And if you ever seen or you heard of watercolor ground, anybody? Daniel Smith makes his watercolor ground. I know Golden makes it, and so does Cindy. What is watercolor? The only thing they add to this, which should make it watercolor ground, which I thought was pretty amusing. Baking soda. So instead of spending big bucks for watercolor ground, there's actually recipes online you can make your own watercolor ground. The thing about watercolor ground, it doesn't work like paper. It's just paint differently. But it's better than painting on gesso, which doesn't allow the watercolor to soak or to penetrate, soak in. The baking soda lets that happen. So now we are talking about next. Oh, and illustrators like it because it doesn't change color. So it won't go from light to dark or dark, you know. When you paint it, the way it looks is the way it looks. And for them, that's advantage. They don't have to wait for that change and make adjustments. So you can mix it with water, quick wash it. It doesn't, for me, it doesn't work very well. And it handles like acrylic. Now, there's different companies that make acrylic wash. I would not recommend liquid text. I saw this whole thing on YouTube shooting it down and saying what they did is they took acrylic paint and they gave it a matte finish and they called it wash. So they didn't make denser pigment and they didn't add the whiting. It's just acrylic paint with a matte finish. But you know, they just sell it and make it easy, so they do that. But there's many other companies that will make acrylic wash. Okay, next. Okay, now we get to the fun one, KC. Now you're all experts. What do I need to change? The binder. So this is Richardson casein emulsion. Screen was done with casein and wax crayon. So you've seen casein, not realizing you're looking at casein. Next. Stephen Quiller. There was the annual watercolor, the American Watercolor Society had an annual show at Sac Fine Arts. And on display in here in the back room was this huge Quiller painting. Some of that stuff in there was. Next. James Gurney, that's a favorite of Carol and myself. I don't see her. Between those two, Quiller and Gurney, they are like the ones that are promoting casein now after like a 50-year gap. And the last great book that was written was by Quiller recently about casein specifically, and there hasn't been anything written about it in like 50 years. Okay. You remember when you bought those little models, well, the guys do, when they bought the little model airplanes and stuff, and I always had a great cover. That was done by Jack Linwood, and he did it with casein. Next. Okay, so this is the weirdest one of the water medium, and probably the least known. Yes.
Can I just ask a question? Like, if you're, say you're out and you're on a sketch crawl and you see something that you're gonna paint, what is going through your mind in terms of picking which of these mediums you are gonna use? Like, what are your qualifiers like in your mind to say, oh, this is gonna lend itself to casein, or I really want to do this in watercolor, or I really want to do this in gouache.
So online, Gurney has like hundreds of YouTube videos of him painting on scene using these different media. And he's just like a genius, and he makes it look simple, but it has a different quality. It appears different. And I will pass out paintings that I did just to show you. Now,
Is there something that you, like, when you look at something that really speaks to you, like, oh, I really want to do this in casein?
Yes and no. In practical terms, you can't beat watercolor. And then on top of that, wash. The casein and acrylic, you've got to be a little more dedicated and more careful. Again, you get the thing of it drying too quick on your brush, or you got to keep things wet. So this connection is called Lumicomp, ACM, aluminum composite material. And they made a sandwich of an aluminum plate, polyethylene core, and aluminum. And on the brush side, I took KC and just painted on the surface. And this is what KC has like. And you notice I'm not worried about the surface. I can pour water, once it's cured, I can put water on it, nothing's gonna affect it. Doesn't need to have a coating. Just like acrylic paintings don't necessarily have to have coating or varnish. And it's been around for 49,000 years. Okay. That's older than me. Okay, so it's the least familiar, but prior to acrylic, everybody in the world used KC. You know, the colonials, when they painted their barns and stuff, it'd be KC paint. So how do you make the KC? You take milk, add some vinegar, and you'll separate the curds and whey. Then you take the curds, rinse out the vinegar, strain it, and you add in what they call hydrated lime. It's used for pickling lime. It's made from limestone. And they end up with a casein glue. That's basically what this is. It's simple. There's recipes where you can make your own paint on it. I wouldn't bother. But it's milk. That's why it's something they call milk paint. Excellent. Oh, unique to casein is its odor. And after we get done talking about it, when we set out the stuff, you can play with the tube, you can smell it. To me, it's got the familiar smell, and it's slightly perfumey. It's not overwhelming. It's looking like thinner or anything. And when it dries and cures, there's no odor at all. Whereas an oil painting, you can smell for weeks. Oh, what is that? Okay, next. It dries. It looks a shade darker than when it dries. Each one of these have different color shade. Watercolor painting, you paint it and it gets lighter. Right? I mean, every one of these has the ship, except for a flip wash, and that is the ship of casein. It can become brittle. So either use 300-pound paper or a panel or board is probably the best. Okay. This is the thing that's neat about casein and unique about it. If I paint on it, I want to make a correction for a day or two, I can easily correct it. Add some water, change it. And then every day it gets progressively more cured. After 3 weeks, water cannot affect it. And it's impervious to water. So it's good to use as an underpainting. You can actually use it as an underpainting for oil painting. And sometimes people will pre-paint a panel or sheet, get an underlayer, and then they go out and they'll do the watercolor or gouache on top of it. It's the closest of these water medias to painting in oil style. Next. You can pin it out, but, and create a gauze effect. And I didn't bring that in, but it's kind of cool. It's got this, you want to do an atmospheric background to your watercolor. You can put this light glaze of white seen and it'll give that atmospheric effect. Next. They say don't use sable brushes. Don't use your expensive sable brushes with KC. Synthetic ain't cheap. It's the same kind of reasoning as your acrylic. You won't take a Winsor Newton Series 7 $200 brush, be painting acrylics with it, and make a mistake of forgetting it for a couple of hours because you just destroyed your brush. It's not that bad, but it's rougher on your brush. Next. This is the relative cost breakdown I did for this medium. So even though it may be smaller of a tube, it'll go farther. And if you wanted to paint a large painting with a matte finish, you actually would not use gouache, you would use KC. It's more cost effective and it covers a large area. Next, like a house. Okay, now we get the fun part. Let's combine next. Okay, Quiller I talked about, I showed the quote. What he likes to do often is do the acrylic on the back and put the casing on top. It's better if you see it. Get this in the style of Quiller. So I did the orange as the underpainting with the acrylic. And then I came on top with the casing. And when you hold it to the light, you can see some parts are shiny, some parts are matte. And that's kind of the effect that he wants. It's kind of a unique effect. I did this casing and there's just all straight casing, there's no varnish. And then you can see the matte appearance of this thing. It's a strange, realistic look to me, but oh, I'm sorry.
So you said that the shiny part, the orange shiny part was the, what was it?
Acrylic.
Acrylic.
Right.
And then the casing has more flat.
It's the flat matte
I
part
see.
of that.
Um,
You can see how they kind of intertwine or make the thing interesting as they create this different texture.
And you
It's not
just,
for your paint.
you could just use them all together. They don't really.
Behind on the acrylic. On that. See the difference. Oh, there's a little more. All right, so an example of pre-painting your watercolor paper and then coming back on top. Next, please. James Gurney would often take a panel, put a KC background on it, and then he comes back on top with a gouache later on. So he, that's combining those two techniques.
That's it. After it totally dries then.
Yes, I would wait. I mean, at least a week,
Oh, really?
maybe a couple weeks for that casing to totally dry. It dries quick, but it doesn't cure quick. The cure will be a couple of weeks. Then you're totally safe putting wet stuff on it and it won't change it. Yeah. So, yes, and if you want to use casing as an underpainting for oil paintings, you just need, let's say, a layer of Damar varnish over the casing. Okay. So what I did on this one, this is Gurney is doing these multiple layers, like, acrylic gouache, Quiller, just what it looks like when the two mediums are kind of put on each other.
I'm sorry. Excuse me. Excuse me?
Yeah.
What's the stating? This is casing.
That's just straight casing. This is just to show,
Bill,
yes,
some of it is shiny looking and some not.
yeah, it could be oil from your hand, it could be stuff. It's basically flat. And what I did on this sheet is I made a grid work. The horizontal line will be casing and the upper line is acrylic. And I put the different mediums across it. You can see how they work together.
They're scientists.
So you can look at all the different effects and combinations and how that would work together. And they work together well. The other thing I did was I was experimenting with, you can varnish casing and you can varnish acrylic. So what I did is I tried different types. The top is wash, bottom is casing, and I've got what do you call it, Dorland wax. You can put a wax finish, satin, gloss, and matte varnishes on it. There's kind of a movement to get away from glass. People just wish they can have real glass. There's a special art show every year called Broken Glass, and these famous artists figure out ways to do their watercolor and whatever, and have it shown in a gallery without glass and be protected. There's a art to that.
Wax.
Yes, you can. That'll work fine.
That's what this is a sample of, right? It's all in wax,
That's Dorland wax.
Dorland wax. So you can use that instead of glass and it preserves it.
Yes.
You just rub it over. Have you done it on one of your paintings? Like rub it over all?
Yes.
How do you like it?
It's okay. Online, there's different tutorials on how to do that. And sometimes they'll put an isolation coat before the wax, or sometimes they'll just use the straight wax. You can take your watercolor painting and mount it to a piece of wood with a acrylic medium, trim it, then do the wax coating on it, and then you don't need glass.
Bill, you do that without varnishing it first?
Yes,
I've never heard of that.
yes.
How do you like the result?
Well, you have it in your hand.
How about after that?
No, I mean, ideally, yeah, that wax is. You can take your hand and a cloth and reshine it and polish it. It won't last. It doesn't change color. It's not. I don't know what's. I don't have the ingredients for going to wax right now, but that's one of the things that we use. Okay, so this is casing with a gloss varnish. So just want to see them. You can see all my experiments.
Yeah, you did them all.
This is watercolor with acrylic on it. Yeah. Fine pen.
How is the acrylic used? Is it Or just a clear coat, or is it on the back of the watercolor? Or is it mixed with the watercolor?
What I did on that one is it was a prime gesso panel, I believe.
Okay.
And I put in the acrylic first. I did sorry, I put in the watercolor first, and then I put the acrylic pattern.
Oh,
This is PC with a gloss varnish. Straight.
Bill, is it, are you spraying or painting on the varnishes? I guess it depends.
Spray.
Spray.
Uh,
Well, actually, I had the rub on, but the others were sprayed.
Yes, you, because I'm learning all this stuff. Of course, you spray it in a varnish, you don't want to do it in your house. It's really powerful, or you want to do it outside. Do it very carefully, because you can re-wet and disturb the paint, especially in this gouache or watercolor. And if the casing, you want to give it a couple weeks to cure, so it can't be affected. So you need to follow some tutorial or explanation online that tells you step by step. Because if you experiment, it could be a call. You don't do this with a fantastic painting, you know what the heck you're doing. So, okay. Painting on a dark surface, what I experimented on was using gouache. If you use watercolor, you try to paint on a dark background, it just disappears. And you can get those fluorescent, not fluorescent, the luminescence, and the little mica chip will show, or maybe some white paint will kind of, but most of it just disappears. So what I have on here on this top part is watercolor, and you don't really see any changes. And on the bottom, you can paint on a dark surface with gouache. So if I were combining mediums and I had a dark background, I wouldn't put watercolor on it. I probably would, if you want to see it.
So the turquoise is the watercolor, and you use the acrylic to the leaf.
Yeah, I almost have to hold that light and kind of see which one is which. If it's shiny, it's acrylic, and if it's not, it's watercolor. Okay, I think we've got that covered. And I did hand out, oh, this is Nathan Folks. So this is, Nathan Folks combines watercolor with gouache, plein air, some of it. And then has a unique look. And I want to kind of experiment with this. I think I will on a little sketch ball. But out of habit, when I start something in watercolor, I end up finishing it watercolor. I say, well, why did I need a gouache? Well, I got to force myself to try these other mediums. Just, it's against my nature, but you need to learn and expand. You need to experiment. And I think I covered just about everything here. Oh, this is an example of acrylic gouache. It looks like acrylic, but it's a very solid color. Okay, now the fun part, questions, yes.
I hardly ever use watercolors, and I have a bunch of dry too. Do any serious watercolors use dry watercolor pans?
You can reconstitute it. So you'd have to cut out the tube and pretend like it's a pan thing, and then you have to work it, which is tough on your brush.
Is the gum arabic gone then?
No,
Just water and pigment?
the water left it, but the binder, which is gum arabic, can be re-moistened, and the pigment didn't change. So it's a matter of getting it wet again and then using it.
Well, that's what I've done. I don't know.
Yes, you can do that. Oh, we're done, but I'll throw in one more thing. Because you didn't have enough to swamp your brain, I'll give you more. So I was talking about,
Could we stop screen sharing so that we can see Bill better?
I'm talking about additives. I'm talking about the basic components of paint. The binder, the dulia, the pigment, then you get your paint. In reality, these commercial companies will have additives, and they will change the behavior of the paint. So you have the binder, the plasticizer, the humectant, the extender, the opacifier, the filler, the plasticizer, the matting agent, the wetting agent, preservative. And some of these things are like dextrin, corn syrup, honey, glycerin. So if those who are familiar with watercolor, you buy M gram, they're known for having honey in the paint. Honey is a humectant. So for Diane, that's one of the reasons they use honey, is so it doesn't dry out. So I don't know if any of you have ever tried laying out a palette of tube paint, and some of those colors will start to dry and it starts to crack. That's what the glycerin prevents. So oftentimes the pan colors will have the glycerin, so it can re-wet easily and it doesn't crack. It keeps it moist. Okay, so now it's just questions and we'll play with this later.
Bill, I have two
Yes.
from online. Carrie said that Blick Golden Open has 1 or 2 ASTM ratings, and she's used them for the 30 by 60 banner for outside. And then someone else asked, do you wax your paintings and put them in floating frames with no glass?
Okay, well, the second part I can, is easy. I only did it to experiment with it, but normally my paintings are watercolors are under glass. But I would like to find a way, it would be great if I didn't have to use glass, and so that's why I'm doing these experiments. And the first question, what was about the rating?
Oh, some thick paint that was rated 1 or 2.
Yeah, it wasn't really a question. It was Carrie was saying she's used that Blick Golden Open has a 1 or 2 ASTM rating, and she's used it for the 30 by 60 banner for outside.
Oh, okay, yeah. Most professional artists will just use the rating 1 or 2. Any questions?
Have you been satisfied with your wax experiment yet? Like, do you feel like you would take one of your really nice paintings and just go for it with the wax instead of glass?
I haven't taken any big paintings and done it yet. I've only done little experiments.
Are you feeling like you want to, or, I mean, are
Yeah,
do you like that?
If there's this gal, her name is Brienne Brown, and she has this YouTube thing, and she's shown nationally, and she was part of that Breaking Glass tour, and she has a very specific set of things to do to make your painting, watercolor painting without glass. Yes,
I'm sorry, what's her name?
Brienne Brown, I believe.
Brianna?
Brienne, Brien.
Dorla's website says you try on acrylic spray before you put the wax on.
Okay, and that would be probably what they will show you on YouTube on how to do it. So I may have put, I wanted an isolation coat before I put on the door. And so, yeah,
You put the wax on.
I read where you can, but I would do it the other way to be sure. Yes,
Sometimes I think that when you don't have the glass, some of them look like they are a copy, a photocopy,
oh, okay.
instead of a watercolor. Just glancing at some of these,
Right,
No,
that's
it's-
interesting.
it's so shiny, it almost looks like, okay, this is a photocopy, it's not original.
Right, and then the,
Nylon changes the finish of the changes the color. Put the nylon and the wax on, but then, yeah, it looks really nice, but it does change the color.
yeah, so when you put on like a gloss varnish on casein, it makes the darks richer. And it does change the look, and you can see the comparison of that one I handed out, which was varnish and which was not. So yeah, it can modify it. You gotta look at those videos to see what you need to do to make it not modified. But on just opposite of what Diane was saying, some of these artists that are part of national artists that are part of the Broken Glass show, they wanted the people to have the immediacy of seeing the art without the glare of glass. And they have they have the opposite view that it's more like what it really is. Personal subject, go ahead.
One point too, when you frame a lot of the watercolors with the mat needs the glass. If you find a way to do the watercolor without glass, then you don't need mats. I mean, just,
Correct.
there's a different layer, but you've got to have mats, a glass has to protect mats. So there's that component, depending on how you want to see it. Right?
Everything's getting expensive. You know, if I didn't have to pay for frames and mats and glass, I'd save money. And if it works, if I can get it to work, it's a cost saving thing.
Yeah.
It's a different look.
I spent a fortune once on just a couple of frames buying that UV anti-glare. I mean,
Yes.
what a fortune.
So the varnishes that you can get, acrylic varnishes, they have the UV filters.
Yeah.
So it serves the same purpose as what the glass would have, that would protect your art.
Well, maybe that's something I missed too, the mat.
What's that?
Maybe that was something I missed on it, the mat.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
a different look. You like mats, then you have that glass.
Right, because it's gonna fall off.
Well, and the mats will work. I mean, even if your watercolor paper, maybe it's mounted, the mats, and they won't, and they'll get dirty.
Mm.
So there's not really, as far as I've seen, there's not a way to protect the mat unless you put glass. Maybe there's a ceiling to put mats, that's not.
No, you're right. You can't really, you're absolutely right about that. You can't, I've ruined a lot of that. I mean, not a lot, but, you know, they get exposed to moisture, they warp and they can discolor, they can do these weird things unless they're under glass. So yeah, if you need to mat it, you try to put it on the glass. What I'm gonna do, if there's no more questions,
I have one question.
okay.
Sorry. I just, have you ever done like, I just have like a plain canvas, just like a cheap plain canvas, and then used like ground and then done a watercolor on there? Is there a
Yes.
reason why you wouldn't want to do that?
I have a couple, I didn't bring those.
Okay,
I'm not happy with the result.
but because, why?
You know, when you paint watercolor on this watercolor ground, you're painting with that baking soda chalk thing, and it just has a certain look, and it doesn't react like watercolor. It's not like watercolor paper. So for all these mediums, if there was a universal ground that would work for all these, it would be 300-pound watercolor paper. And if there was a universal brush for all these, it would be like a synthetic watercolor brush. We have those two things, you can paint anything. So my plan is, and this wasn't my idea, and she left. So she said, well, have everybody play with the stuff and experiment with it. So I brought some brushes and paint and all that kind of stuff, and when we're all done here, we'll cut off a section, and you can smell what casein smells like, and you can see what it looks like when you apply it. You can play with it. And she left. Left me this idea that she started, and no, that's okay.